and welcome to what some might contend is a rather unhealthy video. And who am I to argue? So I'm going to stop just short of calling this one a Ben's junk, even though I could probably quite easily do that. But yeah, this is going to be, I guess, kind of one of my half music and half audio geekery type discussion videos. So the inspiration behind this one was, and it's still ongoing, in recent months I've just been trying to go through all my things and trying to consolidate and organize a bit and, that sort of stuff. Clean up and clean out. And going through some of my music stuff not too long ago, I found myself kind of going, geez, how many copies of this album do I have? And it got me thinking, okay, what do I have the most copies of? And that's what has led us to this. So I should note that I am one of those weirdos that has 2 copies of a lot of albums, as in 1 copy on CD, 1 copy on vinyl. But then we start getting up into 3 copies. So say vinyl, cassette, and CD. Or I owned it on vinyl initially, then got the CD, and then a remastered CD came out, and yeah. Then we start getting crazy. We get into 4 copies or better. So I've got 8 titles to discuss here, and I've got at least 4 copies of each of them. And the first 2, strangely enough, are albums that I do not have any real great affection for. But it was Oddity archive related, and just in the name of making an episode, I wound up having to accrue a certain number of copies of the thing. So anyway, let's get down to business here. So this first one is the only one. It has the distinction of being the only one where all the copies are in the same format. So these are all on vinyl, 4 copies, and that would be Double Rainbow by Terumasa Hino, or Hino, I was never quite clear on that one. So years ago, probably pushing 10 years ago now, I did a video called something to the effect of Dynagroove and Friends. And it was going through various gimmicks with vinyl, be it in the vinyl stock or mastering or whatever gimmick sort of stuff that the labels were dreaming up on a given day during the 60s and or 70s and or 80s. And so when I covered that, I wanted to do some albums that were CX encoded. CX noise reduction, even though I didn't have any CX gear at the time. So I was just trying to find anything CX encoded at all. Whatever I could get cheap, whatever I could get quick, that sort of thing. So one of the titles wound up being this one. As it turned out, however, you can see my note here that this has some sort of funky white buildup in the grooves. And I don't mean somebody loved this album so much that they played it to death and turned the grooves white, which I've been guilty of myself at times. But yeah, it's like they tried to clean it with, you can use a drop of dish soap to clean a record if you really want to, but it's like this person put a half a bottle of Dawn or something on it and totally screwed the record, and you just can't clean it back out. So yeah, this wound up being a bit of a bust in terms of trying to use it to demonstrate CX. Years later, 5 or 6 years later, I did an episode after accruing some CX noise reduction gear on that. So I revisited this one. I went and ordered myself another copy in far better condition. But here's the kicker. So this particular album, this was only issued on vinyl, I believe, here in the States. The other parts of the world got it in different formats. But here in the States, not only was it just vinyl, it was CX encoded vinyl. Well, I wanted a standard copy to measure it against. So, well, the only place I could get one that was a standard LP was from Japan. So I had to have one imported from Japan. And I think I spent far more on the shipping than I did on the album. And then, as it turned out, there was another audiophile kind of issue of it. So one of Columbia's proprietary half-speed mastered deals, which was Japanese as well. So I had, as well, I should say. So I had to import another copy from Japan. So indeed, you can see there's a bit of a price difference there. The standard vinyl was 2,500 yen, and this audiophile one was 3,200. But yes, in trying to make that episode, I wound up with 4 copies of this thing. All right, the second and final album that I can assure you I would not own 4 copies of if it weren't for archive is Loggins and Messina, Full Sail, from 1973. And I don't think it's a bad album, but I'd say there's really only maybe 3 keepers on it, although Watching the River Run may very well be my favorite. Second favorite Loggins and Messina tune. I think Angry Eyes is still my favorite, which is not on this album. But yeah, I picked this up in a thrift store years and years ago, probably pre-archive. And come to think of it, I think I've got most of the Loggins and Messina albums on CD, and I'm pretty sure they all came from thrift stores. But yeah, this is certainly one of them. And yeah, I pulled my favorites from it for my iPod. Yeah, I still use an iPod. Now, I have this habit of picking up audiophile LPs and CDs when I find them in the thrift stores, if they're in decent shape, kind of regardless of what they are, just to hear how they turned out. So at some point in the vinyl bin at a thrift store, I found this Super Disc LP of Full Sail. And this was one of Columbia's little attempts at competing with Mobile Fidelity. Half-speed mastered, pure vinyl stock, audiophile, pricey audiophile vinyl. And they did a real nice job with it. It's a nice sounding album. I've got no complaints about this. Having said that, the CD was just fine in its own right. Of course, this came just a bit later, but yeah, if I have to give the nod to any of them at all, I'll give it to the CD. But if I'm stuck with vinyl, yeah. Now, fast forward a few years at least to when I covered DBX here on Archive, DBX Noise Reduction. I wanted, other copies to stack it up against. So I've seen this on vinyl a million times over the years. I had no trouble whatsoever trying to find a just plain Jane LP of it. But if I wanted to cover DBX, I had to go on Discogs and pay big bucks for the DBX copy of this one. So yes, I have wound up with 4 copies of an album that I would really normally only own twice, and that was by virtue of just being thrift store find, cheapy sort of deal, sort of thing. So back in the late 90s, I kind of had my breaking point with the top 40. I had my big divorce with the top 40. I was like 13 years old. I was just not interested in what the top 40 stations were playing anymore. I didn't really like what the rock station, like modern rock stations were playing. And I just kind of found myself going more and more over to oldies and classic rock. And one of the CDs I picked up during this time was the Byrds' greatest hits. And I'd been hearing some of these tunes since I was a little kid, Mr. Tambourine Man and Turn, Turn, Turn. But yeah, this is from 1967 originally, and they added 3 more cuts for this remastered copy. But yeah, I picked this up fairly early on in my CD days. Now, what they don't tell you is that this is remixed. It's not noted on the packaging or in the liner notes anywhere. You just got to find it out for yourself. And Columbia did this with a fair amount of their mid-60s to early 70s rock albums and folk rock and stuff. And it's kind of annoying, especially in that they opted to do them a lot more dry than they had been. So a lot of those old Columbia releases had this really nice warm reverb to them, and it's just gone now. And then they replaced it with a bunch of EQ on this. So in spite of that, I listened to this for a long time, and this only completely fell out of rotation with me when I accrued those first 4 Byrds albums individually, and older copies at that. So at some point in a used vinyl bin back in Colorado, I picked up this much, much later issue of it on vinyl. So this issue is probably from the mid-'80s, and you can see it's got a barcode on it by now. And this pressing sucks. It's nastily sibilant. You could play this on a real nice turntable with a real nice cartridge, and it's still going to be sibilant from beginning to end. just not well cut at all. By the same token, I have not seen a decent price on a proper 60s period copy of this. And at the same time, I don't really care because I've got the individual albums, at least on CD. Now, having said that, I've accrued 2 more copies of this thing just out of curiosity. And so here's a CD of the original issue of it. And sure enough, it reverts back to the original mixes. And I think it sounds a lot more natural than the remixes. So, yeah. It was one of those things that was, oh, it's $1.99 in the thrift store bin. Yeah, I'll just pick it up and just hear how it turned out. And then on a similar note, at a used record store, one of the more hipstery ones around here, I found this cassette. And this is from the probably early 80s. It's got a barcode on it by this point. But by the same token, it doesn't have any noise reduction. This is one of those rare 80s completely unprocessed, no Dolby, no nothing tapes, totally plain tapes. In spite of that, it sounds really nice. I've got absolutely no heartburn with the sound on this. So yes, this is how I have wound up with 4 copies of the Byrds' greatest hits. This next album I first heard, I think, around the time I started college, and I just absolutely latched on to it. And I had heard a couple of songs from it on the radio over the years, but yeah, had never heard the album. Found it at the local library. Elvis Costello, his first album, My Aim Is True, and one of my favorite albums. And I wound up making a copy of that one from the library. But this is the issue that I had picked up at the library, the then recent Rhino reissue. And then I found this at a real nice price years later. But yeah, so library dupe notwithstanding, that was my first copy. And then going through the used vinyl bins at some, I think, more hipstery record store, I found this UK LP imported from Gem Records of the same album, and this is the UK version. So you might have noticed there's a 45 in there of the song Watching the Detectives. That's because it is not on the UK version of this album. That is the only difference between the two, and then a slight track reordering. But yeah, picked that up, and you know, it was cool to have. But then in a thrift store bin, I found the US version. So we got all 13 tracks now. But ultimately, I just kind of got tired of the kind of overcompressed and overbrightened sound of the Rhino set. And I've owned a few of these Rhino sets, actually. So I wound up just willfully reverting to an early CD here. And this reverts back to the US vinyl running order of this one. So there you go. That's how I wound up with 4 copies of My Aim Is True. All right, related to Elvis Costello, I've got an album here from the guy that produced Costello's first at least 5 albums, and that would be Nick Lowe. So here we go. Another true favorite of mine, Labor of Lust from 1979. Mostly power pop. It does have some more punky moments to it. But that title is no accident, Labor of Lust. This is an absolutely double entendre-laden album. I don't think I've ever heard so many double entendres on a single album anywhere else. So I picked this up when I was a teenager. I was still in high school. And this is the regular US version of it. Now, at the time, it had been on CD, but it was long out of print, and if you could get it at all, like online or anything, the prices were just utterly insane. But I learned online that there was one song on the UK version of this that was not on the US version. However, they stuck it on the B-side of the single. So I found me a copy of the single, which wasn't too hard to do. Cruel to Be Kind, a song that I'd loved since I was a kid, but it just took me a while to get the album. But yeah, on the B-side, that elusive, missing British tune, Endless Gray Ribbon, which is almost more of a country song. It's a pretty dreary ballad with a bit of a country bent, and I can kind of see why it was left off the album, just because while it's a good song, it doesn't fit the album very well. So I was never, the LP sounds all right, but I was never super enthused about it, and I only owned a cheap turntable at the time, and one that was really prone to inner groove distortion unless it was a really, really well done LP. But I did manage to find this cassette copy, and I thought, oh, that'll be better than me trying to deal with the quirks of vinyl. But whoever owned this first played this sucker right into the ground. I mean, this thing is just totally worn out. I tried to transfer it, and it was a bit of a fool's errand. Now, years later, fast forward to 2011, I caught wind of a CD reissue of this, and I pre-ordered it and everything. And this is the UK version. You don't really see the track list here. But yeah, they reissued the UK version. And this is a perfectly decent sounding remaster. It's not brick-walled, it's not too processed, but not too long after this came out, sure enough, I found that elusive old US CD. And I picked it up, and yeah, I've got the complete contents of the US and UK versions on CD at least. But I've gone over to this one as my standard bearer. I just think it sounds a little more natural, not quite as processed as this reissue of the UK version. But yeah, there you go. That's how I wound up with 4 copies of Labor of Lust. All right, now let's get up into 5 copy territory. And in the case of this and the next one, actually, I have owned 6 copies over the years, but I am down to 5. So this is another one of my absolute all-time favorite albums, Pure Prairie League, Bustin' Out, their second album, kind of considered one of the real great country rock albums. Now, when I first got this as a teenager, I was still in high school. It was the old RCA CD from the late 80s, and it is one of the worst freaking sounding things I've ever heard. It may actually be a contender for one of the worst sounding CDs I've ever heard. There is no low end to it. I mean, dare I say, there's probably nothing below 150 hertz on it, maybe even closer to 200. I mean, they just lopped off the low end mercilessly. And to make matters worse, they took the high end, the treble, and just cranked it. So now it's got no low end, and it's shrill to boot. And it sounded so bad. But by the same token, I'd seen it on vinyl several times, just going through used record bins, so it wasn't exactly tough for me to find this on vinyl. And I did that, and the LP sounds way better, way more balanced. Now, this is a Dynaflex LP, one of those more pure vinyl stock RCA discs, but this first came out in 1972, but it didn't really start selling till 75. And I'd be willing to bet heavily this is from that main run in 1975. So this became my standard bearer for a pretty good while. So my first attempt at getting another copy of this on CD, for one, on the RCA Greatest Hits, all but one of the cuts from this album is on there, so that almost counts as another copy, which I do have. It sounds better than the regular CD, but not as good. So my next attempt at it was this British thing. Now, it just looks like a cheap Greatest Hits, Pure Prairie League anthology, and it's not even the right lineup of the group on the cover there. But sure enough, starting with track number 7, it's all 9 cuts of Bustin' Out in sequence. Now, it's pretty much brick-walled. It's way louder than it needs to be. But by the same token, this has become my favorite CD copy of it. It's just got a real nice tonal balance to it. Good lows, good mids, good highs. And yeah, even though it's way compressed, it's the best I've ever heard it sound on CD. So anyway, years later, when was this? I'm trying to look on the back of the CD here. 2006, I got this, a twofer of the first 2 Prairie League albums, And I'd been itching to get the first one on CD for some time, so I just jumped on this when it first came out. Unfortunately, the label Acadia, and I've owned some other Acadia discs and they're not bad, but they used MP3s for their source material on this, like watery, lossy MP3s. It sounds terrible. And to make matters worse, a lot of the songs kind of just cut off. The ones with cold endings kind of get chopped off prematurely. Songs that are supposed to segue into each other don't. Songs that are supposed to fade out get cut off 5 to 10 seconds early. And it just sucks. I hate the CD, but for some reason I've held on to it. So anyway, ultimately, as I said, this other CD has become my standard bearer. But it didn't stop me from experimenting a bit. So at some point, I found another LP of this, still sealed, which I've never opened. But this is an issue from the 80s, so you got the barcode on there, and you can see more or less the date that I picked it up, if my camera will actually focus on it, back in 2008. And then sometime in the years since, I think this was just before I left Colorado, I found a cassette copy in a thrift store bin, and the cassette actually sounds really nice and balanced, and this is an 80s issue, but yeah, it's a real good copy. So yes, I've long gotten rid of that original RCA CD of this, but I've still got 5 out of my 6 copies of Bustin' out. I can just basically reuse the story that I told from that Pure Prairie League LP with this next one. So in this case, I have owned 6 copies over the years. I've still got 5 of them, also on RCA Records, and it's one of my absolute favorite albums. Harry Nilsson, Schmilsson from 1971. So here's my LP of it that I got when I was in 8th or 9th grade, I think. Now, this is not my first copy. I first owned this on CD, and it was the original issue RCA CD, and it's nowhere near the washout that the Pure Prairie League was, but it's pretty flat. And I gave away that CD, ultimately. But yeah, in that period, I picked up this LP, and if you watch some really old episodes of Archive, I used to have rock posters on my wall. The poster from this used to hang on my wall, which is just this same artwork just cropped, so it's just hairy there. But anyway, the reason I felt comfortable giving away that original CD that I had was I had found this British remaster at Borders at one point, the old bookstore. And it's better than the US original RCA CD. It's not quite as good as the vinyl. I mean, this was a revelation when I first heard it compared to the CD. But yeah, it was good enough that I felt like, yeah, I can give away my old copy, try and turn someone else on to this one. But yeah, so this copy became my standard bearer for not that long, actually, maybe just a couple of years, because in 2004, it got remastered. And this is one of those rare occasions where it's remasters done right. I mean, this actually does, as far as I'm concerned, live up to the original vinyl. And this is a real nice sounding slab of vinyl. But yeah, RCA actually did a really good job with that one, and this has become my standard bearer over the years. Now, having said that, at some point in a thrift store bin, I found another LP. This is a little later. This is probably early 80s, I'd say. They gave it a new catalog number by this point, and this became my vinyl play copy for a while. I have dug this one out a couple of times more over the years, so yeah. Got that one, and then not too long before I left Colorado, also in the thrift store, got the cassette, and it's like the Prairie League one, a later 80s issue, and it's actually a really nice sounding tape. I was very pleasantly surprised. So yeah, just like the Pure Prairie League set, I have owned 6 copies, but I'm down to just 5. All right, and now the final album. The Champion, the one that I have owned more copies of than any other, and it's by a technicality. So the final album I have owned 7 copies of over the years, but I'm down to 6. And that would be another all-time favorite of mine, Nick Lowe, Pure Pop for Now People, his first real proper solo outing. Now, this is not my original LP. I got this when I was still in high school, my first copy, and I managed to put a big nasty gash through it. But it wasn't too hard to find on vinyl, so I just, grabbed another copy. And this was my standard bearer for a while. And then I did want something better. I really wanted this on CD, but like Labor of Lust, it was out of print and just crazy expensive. And I had found on the internet that, the UK version of this is way different than the US version. And I found a pretty cheap, a still sealed online copy of the British version of this, Jesus of Cool. And I think it's 3 songs that are not common to both versions. But this is a copy from the late 80s on the Demon label. And the real difference in these 2 versions is the US version leans more towards pop, and the UK version leans much more towards punk. And then sometime not too long after that, I found a still sealed cassette of the US version, and this became my standard bearer for quite a long time. And then fast forward many years, all the way up to 2008, it got reissued. But just the UK version, Jesus of Cool, and although they did add the US stuff as bonus tracks. So, yeah. And then somewhere in the interim, I had managed to pick up, while visiting here before I moved here, at Ernie November's for $5, this 1989 British reissue of the British version of the album. And boy, is it muddy as all hell. It is not a very good sounding record, nor is the cassette, for that matter. But not too terribly long after, actually I think it was just a few months after the CD reissue of Jesus of Cool came out, sure enough, I finally found that ever-elusive US version of Labor of Lust, and you can even see the date on it that the record store put on there. And this has become my standard bearer over the years. And then the stuff unique to the UK version I've just pulled from this CD. So, yeah, I've still got 6 copies of this out of the 7 that I've owned. Granted, a bit of a technicality because there's a definite personality difference between the US and the UK versions. But, yeah, it's still the winner nonetheless. And that's going to be it for today. I'll talk to you again soon.